Your bedtime was once a matter of criminal law. Step into the Middle Ages, a world governed by a bizarre and intricate web of rules that dictated everything from the fabric of your clothes to the ownership of your cat. By the end of this journey, you will discover 22 astonishing laws that reveal how medieval authority shaped daily life in ways you never thought possible. We will uncover why a baker could lose a hand for selling the wrong loaf of bread, and how a simple game of football became an act of rebellion against the crown. This exploration offers a powerful lens through which to view the origins of our own concepts of justice and personal freedom. What do you think it truly meant to be free in a society ruled by such surprising statutes? The price of your daily bread was once a matter of life and limb. In the 13th century, the English crown enacted the Assize of Bread and Ale, a sweeping law that transformed bakers and brewers into some of the most regulated professionals in the land. This was not merely a suggestion, it was a rigid system of price and quality control for the two absolute essentials of the medieval diet. The law fixed the cost, weight, and quality of a loaf based on the current price of grain, ensuring that even during a famine, no baker could exploit the desperate. But the consequences for failure were brutal. A baker caught selling a loaf that was underweight could find himself locked in the pillory, a public wooden frame where he would face the ridicule and rotten food hurled by the very community he had cheated. For repeat offenders, the punishment escalated to the unthinkable, the amputation of a hand. Every loaf sold was a high-stakes transaction. The scrutiny extended to the local tavern. To ensure ale was not adulterated with cheap sweeteners, officials known as ale conners were appointed. Their method of testing was as peculiar as it was practical. They would pour a sample of the brew onto a wooden bench and sit in the puddle. If their leather breeches stuck to the seat, the ale was deemed too sugary, and the brewer faced a heavy fine. This bizarre practice underscores a world where the government reached directly into the pantry and the pint, enforcing a moral economy where a just price was considered a divine right. This paternalistic control, however harsh, reveals a society deeply anxious about scarcity and fraud, willing to use terrifying punishments to maintain order in the marketplace. But the law's reach did not stop at food and drink. It sought to control the very clothes on your back, dictating who could wear what in a stunning display of social engineering. Your social standing was literally woven into the fabric of your clothes. Across medieval Europe, a complex system of rules known as sumptuary laws dictated every aspect of personal attire, transforming fashion into a rigidly enforced language of class. These statutes were designed to prevent anyone from dressing above their station, ensuring that a person's place in the social hierarchy was visible at a single glance. A common laborer or peasant was legally barred from wearing luxurious materials like silk, velvet, or sable fur, which were reserved exclusively for the nobility. The colors you could wear were just as controlled. Rich purple, often extracted from rare sea snails, was typically restricted to royalty alone, while vibrant scarlets and deep azure blues required a certain level of wealth and status to wear legally. This was not about taste, it was about control. The fear was that if a merchant's wife could dress like a duchess, the entire visual foundation of the social order would crumble. The act of wearing the wrong color or fabric was seen as a direct challenge to the aristocracy, an offense known as aping your betters. Enforcement was serious. If you were caught in an illegal garment, you could face a heavy fine, and the coveted clothing itself would be confiscated and destroyed. Imagine saving for years to buy a single bolt of fine wool. only to have it torn from your back by a bailiff because your birth did not grant you the right to wear it. These laws reveal a world deeply anxious about social mobility, where the ruling class used the most personal of choices, what you wore each morning, to reinforce its power. This obsession with controlling public appearance extended even further into the profound and absolute silence of the night. The sound of a single bell could command an entire town to extinguish its fires and go to sleep. This was the curfew, a law born from a very real and constant terror, the fear of fire. The word itself comes from the old French phrase couvre-feu, which literally means cover fire. Each night, at a time dictated by the local authorities, a church bell would ring out across the rooftops. Upon hearing it, every household was legally required to either put out their hearth fire completely or cover it with a metal lid to smother the flames. In an age where towns were a dense tinderbox of wooden houses and thatched roofs, an unchecked spark could leap from a single home and reduce a thriving community to ashes in a matter of hours. The curfew was not a suggestion, it was a critical public safety measure. Remaining awake with a burning fire after the bell was an act of criminal negligence. Those caught violating the curfew could face significant fines, and in some places, even harsher punishment, as their actions were seen as a direct threat to the lives and property of all their neighbors. This law imposed a collective rhythm on society, forcing everyone into the same state of darkness and rest for the safety of the whole. It was a profound intrusion into the private sphere, all in the name of the common good. Yet, this was not the only way medieval authorities reached into the home. Another law turned a common household companion into a matter of state interest and economic strategy. Even your household cat was considered a vital economic asset, its life assigned a precise value by the law. In medieval Wales, a detailed legal code laid out the cat tax, a system that treated feline ownership as a serious financial and communal duty. A kitten, before it could even open its eyes, was legally worth a single penny. But once that cat grew into a proven mouser, one that had cleared a barn of vermin, its value skyrocketed. This was not sentimental, it was brutally practical. A single cat protected precious grain stores from rats and mice, a service directly linked to a community's survival against famine. The procedure for claiming compensation if your cat was killed or stolen was as strange as it was specific. The owner had to hang the dead cat by its tail, letting its nose just touch the floor. The person responsible for the cat's death then had to fill the space beneath it with grain, stacking it as high as the tip of the cat's tail. This pile of grain was the official payment, a tangible measure of the animal's worth to your household and the wider food supply. This law reveals a world where every resource, every living creature that served a purpose, was meticulously catalogued and protected by statute. It shows a legal system deeply intertwined with daily survival, where the loss of a good mouser was a genuine economic disaster. This focus on value and compensation extended far beyond barn cats, reaching into the most serious of personal conflicts and defining the very price of a human life. A human life, from a king to a common farmer, had an exact price tag. This was the principle of weregild, a foundational legal concept across early medieval Europe that sought to impose order on the chaos of violence. Under this system, every person was assigned a specific monetary value, a man price, that had to be paid by a killer or their family to the family of the victim. This payment was not a fine to the state, but a direct compensation to the grieving relatives, a formal and legally binding offer intended to halt the ancient and devastating tradition of the blood feud. Without it, the murder of one person could trigger a cycle of retaliatory killings that could wipe out entire families over generations. The Wergild tariff was a meticulous document of human worth, starkly reflecting the rigid social hierarchy. The life of a churl, a common freeman, might be valued at 200 shillings. A nobleman's life could be worth 6 times that amount. The weregild for a king was so astronomically high it was practically unpayable, cementing the idea that an attack on the monarch was an attack on the entire social order. The system was granular, assigning value not just for death but for injury. The loss of a thumb had one price, the loss of an ear another, and the loss of a foot yet another. This created a bizarre but precise economy of harm, where every wound could be settled with coin rather than blood. It was a brutal calculation, yet it represented a profound shift from raw vengeance to a form of communal justice, where the state, in its early form, began to mediate conflict by placing a concrete value on peace itself. This attempt to legislate order extended from the value of a person to the very land they stood upon, governed by laws that dictated how the earth itself could be used and shared. The very ground beneath your feet could be declared a crime scene by royal decree. After his conquest of England, William I carved out vast territories known as royal forests, imposing a brutal legal regime known as forest law. These were not necessarily dense woodlands, but rather legal zones where the king's right to hunt game, particularly deer and wild boar, became the supreme law of the land. For the people who lived and farmed within these boundaries, life was transformed overnight. The deer that ate your crops were no longer pests, they were the king's property. Hunting one to feed your family was not survival. It was a capital offense punishable by blinding or even execution. The penalty for simply disturbing the king's deer could be the loss of a hand. This law reached into the most mundane tasks. You could be fined for cutting down a tree for firewood, for building a fence around your own vegetable patch to keep those very deer out, or for allowing your dog to run loose if it was large enough to chase game. Forest law created its own courts and its own officers, a parallel justice system that existed solely to protect the monarch's leisure. It criminalized generations of traditional subsistence, turning everyday survival into an act of trespass against the crown. This was the law weaponized not for order but for privilege, reserving the bounty of the land for the amusement of one man, while an entire population lived in fear of their next meal. This top-down control over the landscape extended beyond hunting grounds, reaching into the very soul of rural life through a law that governed both spiritual duty and economic output. 1/10 of everything you produced, from the wheat in your field to the lambs in your flock, belonged to God. The tithe was far more than a pious donation. It was a legally enforceable tax that every Christian was obligated to pay to the church. This religious levy demanded a precise 10% of your annual income or agricultural yield. When you harvested your grain, you were required to set aside 1 sheaf out of every 10. When your sheep were shorn, 1/10 of the wool went to the church. Even the birth of a new calf or piglet meant one would eventually be marked for the tithe collector. This was not a system built on voluntary charity. It was a cornerstone of medieval law, with secular authorities often stepping in to compel payment from those who refused. Failure to pay was not just a financial misstep, it was a mortal sin that could lead to excommunication, cutting you off from the sacraments and the entire spiritual community. In a world where salvation was the ultimate concern, this was a terrifying prospect. The collected wealth funded the local parish priest, maintained the physical church building, and provided a rudimentary social safety net for the destitute and the sick. In this way, the tithe bound the community together, making the church the administrator of both spiritual grace and earthly welfare. Yet for the peasant family struggling to survive a lean year, handing over 1/10 of their meager harvest could feel like an immense burden, a divine mandate that sometimes left their own children hungry. Resentment simmered when people saw their hard-earned goods supporting a lavish lifestyle for a distant bishop rather than their own local poor. The tithe reveals a society where spiritual and temporal power were inextricably fused, with the church acting as a vast, state-sanctioned economic engine. This same system of obligation and control reached down to dictate the very value of a single day's work. Your entire life could be dictated by the boundaries of a single field. For the vast majority of people in the Middle Ages, the law did not promise freedom, but rather enforced a permanent bond to the land and its owner. These individuals were serfs, a class of peasants who were legally tied to the manor of their lord. They were not slaves who could be bought and sold as individuals, but the law treated them as a form of property attached to the soil itself. Their existence was governed by a relentless cycle of obligation known as week work. For typically 2 or 3 days every single week, a serf was legally compelled to abandon their own small plot of land and instead labor for free on the lord's personal estate, the demesne. They would plow the fields, harvest the crops, and tend the lord's livestock, all while their own family's survival back on their meager strip of land hung in the balance. This was just the beginning of their dues. They also owed a share of their own harvest, paid fees to use the manorial oven and mill, and even owed a tax, the Heriot, which gave the lord their best beast upon their death. The law reached into the most personal aspects of life. A serf needed their lord's permission to marry, often paying a fine for the privilege. They could not leave the manor to seek a better life elsewhere, and they could not even sell their own ox or cow without their lord's consent. A serf who attempted to flee was declared a criminal, and the lord had the full legal authority to hunt them down and drag them back to the land. This entire system, this legal framework of bonded labor, was the silent, grinding engine that powered the feudal economy. It guaranteed the aristocracy a permanent, unfree workforce, ensuring that the fields were always tended and the manors always supplied. It demonstrates with brutal clarity how the law was not a tool for justice, but an instrument for cementing a rigid social structure where your birth determined your destiny. Yet, even within this world of relentless toil, the law sought to control the few moments of respite and play. The king himself declared your favorite game a crime. In 1314, King Edward II of England issued a royal proclamation that outlawed the playing of football, a chaotic and sprawling village tradition that bore little resemblance to the modern sport. The official reason was that these matches created a great noise in the city and were a game of no value, but the true motivation went far deeper than a simple complaint about public disturbance. These games, which could involve hundreds of players from rival villages fighting to move a ball across a vast field, often through streams and streets, were seen as a dangerous distraction. They diverted the energy and time of able-bodied young men from a far more critical duty, practicing with the longbow. In an era where England's military strength relied heavily on its legendary archers, every hour spent kicking an inflated pig's bladder was an hour not spent honing the skill that could win a war. The Crown viewed this not as a simple pastime, but as a direct threat to national security. Subsequent monarchs repeated this ban, with penalties ranging from heavy fines to imprisonment for those caught organizing or playing the game. This was the state reaching into the village green, dictating that even moments of leisure and community play had to serve the strategic interests of the realm. It reveals a society where personal freedom was constantly balanced against the perceived needs of the crown, where the joy of a game could be criminalized in the name of communal defense. This desire to regulate the most personal aspects of life extended from the public field directly into the private home. dictating the very terms of love and family through another set of surprising laws. The most intimate moment of a serf's life could be claimed by their lord. This is the infamous droit du seigneur, or the lord's right of the first night, a legal concept so shocking it has become the stuff of dark legend. While historians fiercely debate how often it was actually practiced, its powerful presence in law codes and popular stories reveals an uncomfortable truth about medieval society. The idea was that a feudal lord held the legal authority to spend the wedding night with the bride of any of his serfs before her husband could. In reality, this was often more a symbolic assertion of power than a literal practice. Most serfs could buy their way out of this humiliation by paying a special tax to the lord, a fine for the privilege of marriage. This payment, known in some regions as the merchant, was the lord's real objective, a straightforward financial transaction. Yet the mere threat, the legal possibility, hung over every wedding in the village. It transformed the profound bond of marriage into a transaction that required the lord's approval and participation. This concept, whether enacted or not, served as the ultimate symbol of a lord's dominion, a stark reminder that his authority reached from the fields they plowed directly into their bedrooms. It defined the serf not as a citizen with rights, but as an extension of the land, whose body and its most personal relationships were subject to the will of their master. This control over the lives of individuals was mirrored by a system of control over the very things they bought and sold, governed by a law that dictated where and how you could trade. A single cart of salt could be taxed a dozen times before it ever reached your table. This was the reality of medieval commerce, governed by a dense web of market regulations and toll laws. Local lords and towns held the exclusive legal right to establish official markets, and they jealously guarded this privilege. If you were a farmer with a surplus of grain or a potter with a load of clay jugs, the law did not allow you to simply sell them from your doorstep. You were compelled to bring your goods to the official market on the official market day, where everything could be inspected, controlled, and most importantly, taxed. This was the toll, a payment demanded at almost every conceivable point of passage. A merchant transporting wine up a river would pay a toll to the lord of the castle overlooking the waterway. His cart would be stopped again at a bridge, and yet again when he finally reached the town gate. Each of these payments, small on their own, added a significant cost to the final price of the goods, a burden ultimately passed on to the customer. Inside the market itself, officials enforced the use of standardized weights and measures. They inspected the bronze scales and the wooden bushel baskets to ensure a pound of flour was truly a pound and a gallon of ale was truly a gallon. A merchant caught using doctored weights faced immediate and public shame. He would be locked in the pillory. The fraudulent scales often hung around his neck, while the townspeople voiced their displeasure. This system was designed to protect consumers from fraud and to guarantee a steady stream of revenue for the local authority, but it created a patchwork economy where the price of a commodity could double in the space of 20 miles. It reveals a world of intensely localized power, where every bridge and every wall represented not just a physical barrier, but a financial one. This intricate control over commerce and justice extended even to the resolution of violent crime, where the law provided a surprising alternative to the blood feud. A desperate fugitive could find absolute safety within the cold stone walls of a church. This was the right of sanctuary, a powerful legal tradition where the spiritual authority of the church created a temporary island of immunity in a world of harsh justice. If you could physically touch the door of a cathedral or grasp the heavy ring of its sanctuary knocker, you were, by law, untouchable. For 40 days, the king's men could not cross that sacred threshold to arrest you. You were given a place to sleep in the church porch and food brought by the local parish, all while remaining safe from your accusers. But this protection was not a permanent pardon. It was a tense pause, a 40-day truce between the power of the state and the power of God. When that period ended, you faced an impossible choice. You could finally leave the church and stand trial, facing a justice system known for its brutal punishments. Or you could choose the other path, a ritual known as abjuration of the realm. This required you to publicly confess your crime before a coroner. Then, barefoot and dressed in the rough robes of a penitent, you would be given a wooden cross to hold. You were then directed to walk to the nearest port, never straying from the main road, and once there, you had to find the first ship that would take you and leave your homeland forever. If you were ever caught returning from this forced exile, the penalty was immediate execution. This law created a stark, structured alternative to the gallows. It allowed the church to demonstrate its mercy while still acknowledging secular authority, exiling a problem rather than solving it. This intricate dance between church and state extended to the regulation of other critical pillars of society, including the craftsmen who built the very cathedrals that offered such refuge. Your choice of career was not a matter of free will, but a path dictated by a legally binding contract. The craft and merchant guilds stood as the absolute gatekeepers of medieval commerce, their authority enshrined in town charters and royal law. To practice any skilled trade, from blacksmithing to weaving, you first had to be accepted into a guild. This was not a simple club. It was a corporate body with the legal power to grant a monopoly, forbidding anyone outside its membership from selling their wares within the town walls. The journey began with apprenticeship, a formal agreement sealed between a master craftsman and the parents of a young boy, often for a term of 7 years. This contract was not merely a promise, it was enforceable in court. The master gained a source of cheap labor, and in return, he was legally obligated to provide the apprentice with food, lodging, clothing, and a complete education in the secrets of the craft. The apprentice, in turn, was bound to his master. He could not leave, marry, or work for anyone else during those long years. His life was one of total obedience, starting with the most menial tasks and slowly, painstakingly, learning the skills that would one day grant him a place in the world. The guild hall was the center of this universe. Here, the masters enforced strict ordinances that governed everything. They set the exact price for a pair of shoes or a length of cloth. They decreed the number of hours a craftsman could work by daylight, forbidding work by candlelight to prevent the production of shoddy goods under poor conditions. They inspected workshops to ensure the quality of materials and workmanship, and a craftsman found using inferior wool or thin metal could face heavy fines or even expulsion from the guild, a sentence of professional death. This system created remarkable stability and produced goods of incredibly consistent quality, but it was designed to resist change and protect the interests of those already in power. The final, daunting hurdle was the masterpiece. After his years as an apprentice and further time spent as a journeyman working for wages, a man seeking the title of master had to fund the creation of a single, perfect piece of work. This masterpiece was then presented to the guild masters for judgment. If they deemed it worthy, he could open his own shop and take his place among them. If they rejected it, often for reasons that had more to do with limiting competition than pure skill, his ambitions were crushed. The guild laws transformed economic life into a rigid, hierarchical structure, where the law protected not the individual's right to compete, but the collective's right to control. This obsession with control extended from the workshop to the very words that could be spoken in public, where a careless insult could land you in front of a church court. Your own words could land you in the stocks. In a world without mass media, a person's reputation was their most valuable asset. a fragile form of social currency protected by surprisingly robust laws against slander. To publicly spread a false and damaging statement about a neighbor was not just a petty quarrel, it was a prosecutable offense in both the manorial and church courts. A man falsely accused of being a thief or a woman maligned as unfaithful could sue their accuser for defamation, demanding a public retraction and financial compensation for the harm done to their good name. This legal process made a private insult a matter of public record, forcing the community to witness the restoration of honor. But the law also targeted a more general and often gendered nuisance, the offense of being a common scold. This legal label was typically applied to a woman who was deemed a habitual disturber of the peace, someone whose constant gossiping, shouting, and quarreling poisoned the atmosphere of the entire neighborhood. A common scold was seen as a public menace, a human spark that could ignite feuds between families and shatter the fragile harmony of a tightly knit community. The punishments were designed to match the crime's public nature. A scold could be fined or sentenced to time in the stocks, where she would be subjected to the ridicule and rotten vegetables hurled by the very neighbors she had tormented. For repeat offenders, the law reserved its most infamous and humiliating tool, the ducking stool. This was a chair fastened to the end of a long wooden beam, positioned at the edge of a pond or river. The condemned scold would be strapped into the chair and then plunged into the cold water repeatedly, a terrifying and very public spectacle meant to cool her off-heated temper and wash away her foul words. This brutal ritual was less about causing physical harm and more about administering a profound social correction, using communal shame to reintegrate or at least silence a disruptive voice. These laws reveal a society that understood the destructive power of words, policing speech to maintain the social fabric in an era where public order relied on personal honor and neighborly cooperation. Just as the law sought to manage the flow of harmful words, it also had to govern the flow of an even more essential element, the water that sustained every aspect of life. The gentle flow of a river could be the source of your greatest legal trouble. In a world powered by water and muscle, access to this vital resource was not a right but a fiercely guarded legal privilege. The most intrusive of these regulations was the law of mill soak. On almost every manor, the local lord held an absolute monopoly on the milling of grain. This meant every one of his tenants, every serf and free farmer, was legally compelled to bring their harvested wheat and rye to the lord's watermill or windmill. They could not simply grind their own flour at home using a small hand-turned quernstone. To do so was an act of theft, stealing potential profit from the Lord himself. The price for this forced service was a portion of the grain called the multure. After the miller ground your hard-earned harvest, he would take a significant share, sometimes as much as 1 bag in every 20 as his toll. This system ensured the Lord profited not just from the land you worked, but from the very process of turning your raw labor into edible food. Disputes over water were constant and complex. A lord upstream who built a new fish weir could inadvertently lower the water level downstream, crippling his neighbor's mill. The right to set up fishing nets, to draw water for irrigation, or to float timber down river was all meticulously defined in legal charters. A farmer who diverted a stream to water his own field without permission could find himself in the manorial court, facing a heavy fine for stealing the Lord's water. Control over the mill was control over life itself, as the Lord's cut of the flour represented a direct tax on the most fundamental act of survival. This authority over the means of production did not end with a person's life. The law reached even beyond the grave, dictating the final destination of a person's worldly goods. Death could not free you from your debts. In the days following a serf's passing, the lord of the manor arrived to collect the Heriot, a mandatory death tax that stripped the grieving family of their most valuable possession. This was almost always the best beast, the finest ox or milk cow that represented the very foundation of the household's livelihood. The legal justification for this painful custom was ancient, rooted in the idea that a lord had once loaned his tenant the weapons and equipment needed for defense. Upon the man's death, that equipment, symbolized by his best possession, was to be returned. Over centuries, this symbolic return had warped into a straightforward and lucrative source of income for the lord, a final, brutal withdrawal from the economic life of his dependent. The family watched as the official led away the powerful plow ox that would have tilled their fields for the next season, or the prized dairy cow whose milk and cheese sustained their children. This was a devastating financial blow delivered at a moment of maximum vulnerability, and the lord was not the only claimant. As the family prepared for the funeral, the church arrived to demand its own due, the mortuary. This was typically the second best animal or another item of significant value from the household. In theory, this payment covered the funeral rites and prayers for the deceased soul, securing their passage into the afterlife. In practice, it was another compulsory fee, a spiritual toll levied at the gates of heaven. Imagine the anguish of a widow, having just lost her husband and her family's primary ox to the Lord, now being forced to surrender their best ewe to the parish priest. These laws of Heriot and Mortuary ensured that the feudal chain of obligation reached beyond the grave, binding a person to their lord and their god with unbreakable economic ties. They transformed the profound, universal experience of mourning into a cold, legally enforced transaction. This relentless extraction of value from the land and its people extended to the management of another critical resource, one that swam in the rivers and ponds of the manor. The rabbit darting across a common field was not a meal waiting to be caught, but a criminal indictment in the making. While forest law protected the king's grand deer, another statute, the right of free warren, secured the nobleman's monopoly on smaller prey. This legal privilege, granted by royal charter, gave a lord the exclusive right to hunt rabbits, hares, pheasants, and partridges on his designated lands. For a peasant family struggling to fill their pot, the sight of a plump hare on common land they had used for generations was a cruel taunt. To take it was not subsistence, it was poaching, a direct theft from the aristocracy. The penalties were harsh, ranging from heavy fines and imprisonment to, in some cases, execution. This law did more than stock the lord's larder with delicacies. It created a stark, legally enforced protein barrier. It reserved valuable wild meat for the elite tables while turning the traditional hunter into a criminal, ensuring that the social hierarchy was reflected not just in land ownership, but in every morsel of food. This rigid control over resources extended seamlessly into the pivotal moment of a family's continuity, when the law dictated exactly how a lifetime of labor could be passed to the next generation. Your final act on earth was to watch the law dismember your life's work. The medieval rules of inheritance were not about fulfilling a dying person's wishes, but about preserving the economic structure of the manor and the lord's control over its assets. For the vast serf population, the principle of primogeniture was brutally straightforward. Upon a man's death, his entire landholding, the small strip of fields that had fed his family for generations, passed undivided to his eldest surviving son. This was not a reward for the firstborn, it was a matter of administrative convenience for the lord. A single, consolidated tenancy was easier to manage and tax than a farm splintered among multiple heirs. For the younger sons and all the daughters, this law was a sentence of landless poverty. They were left with nothing but the clothes on their backs, forced to hire themselves out as laborers on the very land their brother now controlled. or to leave the manor entirely in a desperate search for work. But the law's intrusion was even more personal. Before any inheritance could occur, the lord exercised his right of Heriot, claiming the family's best animal, and the church took its mortuary, the second best. Only after this double extraction of wealth could the heir claim his diminished legacy. If a man died with no sons, the situation grew even more precarious. The land could pass to a daughter, but the lord often had the legal right to arrange her marriage, selling her hand to the highest bidder to ensure a capable man was running the farm and paying its dues. In some regions, if there were no children at all, the land and all its goods would revert entirely to the lord, a process called escheat, wiping out a family's presence from the land in a single legal stroke. These inheritance laws transformed grief into a calculated transfer of assets, ensuring that the feudal machine, powered by tied labor and predictable rents, would continue uninterrupted by the inconvenient fact of human mortality. A younger son could watch his entire birthright vanish with the reading of a single will. Primogeniture was the legal engine that drove the feudal system, a brutal rule of inheritance designed to preserve wealth and power at all costs. Under this law, a family's entire landed estate, from its sprawling fields to its manor house, passed undivided to the eldest living son. This was not about fairness or a father's affection. It was a cold calculation to prevent the fragmentation of a noble family's power base. If an estate was divided among 5 sons, it would create 5 weaker, poorer lords, each unable to field the knights or pay the taxes required by the crown. The entire military and political structure of the realm depended on keeping these blocks of land and authority intact. For those not born first, the law presented a stark future. Younger sons were often funneled into the church, where they could pursue power as bishops or abbots, or they were pushed into a life of military service, becoming landless knights dependent on the charity of their elder brother or a wealthy patron. Daughters were treated as diplomatic assets, their value measured by the size of the dowry that could be assembled to secure a politically advantageous marriage. This system created a powder keg of resentment within noble households. Ambitious younger brothers, denied their share, often turned into rivals, scheming to claim what the law had denied them. While this legal framework provided a stable, predictable pattern of land ownership for centuries, it also cemented a rigid class structure, ensuring that the vast majority of property and power remained locked in the hands of a select few families, generation after generation. The law reached beyond the nobility, dictating the very materials and dimensions of the homes those families lived in. The timber frame of your house was a matter of public safety and legal scrutiny. Medieval building codes, known as Assizes of Buildings, were enacted in towns and cities across Europe in direct response to the ever-present threat of catastrophic fires. These laws dictated everything from the minimum thickness of party walls between properties to the types of materials that could be used for roofing. In London after the Great Fire of 1216, regulations demanded that new houses along the main thoroughfares be built of stone and have tiled roofs, effectively banning the traditional and highly flammable wattle and daub walls and thatched roofs in the city centre. The law even specified the required height of a party wall, ensuring it rose above the roof line to act as a firebreak, preventing flames from leaping from one home to the next. Enforcement was a communal duty. Official viewers appointed by the town council had the legal right to enter any property to inspect its construction. A homeowner found with an illegally thin wall or a roof made of straw faced a court order to tear it down and rebuild at their own expense. This was the law reaching into the very skeleton of a city, imposing a collective standard of safety over individual convenience. It reveals a society learning to manage the dangers of dense urban living, using legal force to protect the entire community from the reckless choices of a single neighbor. The timber frame of your house was a matter of public safety and legal scrutiny. Medieval building codes, known as Assizes of Buildings, were enacted in towns and cities across Europe in direct response to the ever-present threat of catastrophic fires. These laws dictated everything from the minimum thickness of party walls between properties to the types of materials that could be used for roofing. In London after the Great Fire of 1216, regulations demanded that new houses along the main thoroughfares be built of stone and have tiled roofs, effectively banning the traditional and highly flammable wattle and daub walls and thatched roofs in the city centre. The law even specified the required height of a party wall, ensuring it rose above the roofline to act as a firebreak, preventing flames from leaping from one home to the next. Enforcement was a communal duty. Official viewers appointed by the town council had the legal right to enter any property to inspect its construction. A homeowner found with an illegally thin wall or a roof made of straw faced a court order to tear it down and rebuild at their own expense. This was the law reaching into the very skeleton of a city, imposing a collective standard of safety over individual convenience. It reveals a society learning to manage the dangers of dense urban living, using legal force to protect the entire community from the reckless choices of a single neighbor. This pragmatic approach to preserving the community extended beyond the structures people lived in, reaching into the fragile human body and the perilous practice of medicine. A single mistaken diagnosis could lead to a trial for murder. In an era without formal medical licenses, the line between a healer and a criminal was dangerously thin. Town governments, desperate to curb the rampant dangers of quackery and incompetence, began to enact laws that regulated who could practice medicine and under what conditions. In many cities, a person had to secure a license from a board of established physicians or the town council itself before they could legally treat patients for a fee. This process often involved swearing an oath to uphold certain standards and to refrain from using dangerous or secret remedies. An unlicensed barber surgeon who botched a bloodletting or an apothecary who sold a poisonous concoction could be dragged before a court and charged with manslaughter. The penalties were severe, ranging from heavy fines and public whipping to banishment from the city. For the patient, there was little recourse beyond these criminal statutes. This legal framework was a primitive attempt to instill accountability, to distinguish between a tragic error and criminal negligence. It placed the authority to heal not in individual skill alone, but in the permission granted by the community. In a world where illness was mysterious and death was ever present, the law sought to bring a sliver of order to the chaos of the human body, making the physician's work a matter of legal as well as moral responsibility. The right to heal became a crime if you lacked the proper university degree. By the 13th century, a profound shift was underway in the world of medicine, moving it from a craft of inherited wisdom to a credentialed profession governed by law. In places like the Kingdom of Sicily, new statutes made it illegal to practice medicine without a license that could only be earned after years of formal study at a recognized university. This legal framework demanded that a physician be trained in the classical texts of Galen and Hippocrates, grounding his practice in a standardized body of knowledge rather than the variable skills of an apprentice. The apothecary mixing remedies in his shop faced similar scrutiny. His shelves were subject to random inspection by town officials, who checked that his herbs were not spoiled, his weights were true, and his potent mixtures were not fraudulent. A merchant caught selling fake unicorn horn or watered-down opium faced severe fines and the very public destruction of his stock. This legal push was born from a genuine desire to protect a vulnerable public from charlatans and poisoners, to bring order to the chaotic and often deadly marketplace of healing. Yet this noble intention had a dark and unintended consequence. It systematically criminalized a vast network of traditional healers who were often the only medical help available to the rural poor. These were the wise women who knew which local plants could reduce a fever or ease a difficult birth, skills passed down through generations. Under the new laws, their invaluable work was reclassified as unlicensed practice. A woman successfully treating a child with a poultice of yarrow and honey could now be dragged before a court, not for causing harm, but for the simple act of practicing without a diploma. In an atmosphere already thick with suspicion, this legal accusation could easily spiral into a far more dangerous charge of witchcraft, transforming a community healer into a perceived agent of the devil. This was not just about regulating medicine, it was a power struggle over who held the right to define truth and authority in the realm of the human body. The law began to draw a bright, legal line between sanctioned science and suppressed superstition, a division that would shape Western medicine for centuries to come. This growing web of official control soon extended to another fundamental aspect of life, the very ability to move from one place to another and find shelter for the night. An innkeeper could be sued for the theft of a traveler's saddlebags, even if he had no part in the crime. This was the duty of the inn, a legal doctrine that transformed roadside taverns into bastions of enforced trust. In a landscape rife with highwaymen and uncertain roads, the law placed a heavy burden of responsibility squarely on the shoulders of the innkeeper. He was legally compelled to offer a room and stable space to any traveler who appeared at his door, provided the traveler had the coin to pay. He could not turn away a weary merchant or a wandering pilgrim without facing legal consequences. But this obligation to serve came with an even greater duty, a guarantee of security. The innkeeper became the unofficial insurer of everything his guest brought within the walls. If a horse was stolen from the stable or a locked chest was pilfered from a room, the innkeeper himself was held financially liable. He had to compensate the traveler for the full value of the loss, a ruinous prospect that could destroy his business. This was not a matter of proving the innkeeper was negligent or in league with the thieves. The mere fact that the theft occurred on his property made him responsible. This radical legal principle created a powerful incentive for innkeepers to maintain secure premises, hire trustworthy stable hands, and foster a reputation for safety. Why would the law be so unforgiving? Because the entire machinery of medieval trade and governance depended on reliable travel. Kings needed their messengers to move swiftly, merchants needed to transport goods to market, and pilgrims needed safe passage to holy sites. By making innkeepers the legally accountable guardians of the wayfarer, the law built a chain of secure way stations across the kingdom. It imposed trust by statute, forcing a vital service industry to be dependable. This framework allowed commerce and communication to flow through a dangerous world, proving that sometimes the law must compel hospitality to make a society function. This same reliance on communal responsibility defined the final, and perhaps most personal, law that governed every man in his own neighborhood. A sudden shout in the marketplace could legally command the actions of an entire village. This was the hue and cry, a law that transformed every ordinary person into an agent of justice. If you witnessed a theft or an assault, you were not merely encouraged to call for help, you were legally required to raise your voice and scream, creating an immediate, piercing alarm. Upon hearing that cry, the law demanded that every able-bodied man within earshot drop his tools, abandon his meal, and join the frantic chase. The butcher, the baker, the blacksmith, all were instantly deputized, forming a spontaneous, shouting posse to hunt down the offender. This was not a voluntary act of good citizenship. It was a compulsory duty enforced by the threat of a collective fine. If a criminal escaped because neighbors failed to join the pursuit, the entire community could be held financially responsible for the crime. This system made policing a shared burden, relying on speed and numbers to corner a thief before he could vanish into the woods. It created a world where your safety depended not on a distant sheriff, but on the swift reaction of the people living around you. The hue and cry wove the concept of collective responsibility directly into the fabric of daily life, making justice a noisy, chaotic, and deeply communal affair. These 22 laws, from the price of bread to the cry for justice, reveal a world where authority was personal, intrusive, and inescapable. They show us a society striving for order through control, where the law touched everything from the clothes on your back to the thoughts you expressed. But what does this intricate tapestry of rules ultimately tell us about the people who lived under them and the world we have inherited from their struggles? Law was not written but discovered, unearthed from the eternal principles of divine order and ancient custom. To the medieval mind, the rules governing daily life were not invented by kings or parliaments. They were a sacred inheritance, a reflection of a cosmic blueprint authored by God. This belief transformed the law from a set of human regulations into a fundamental truth that society was obligated to find and follow. The most powerful legal force was often not a royal decree, but the weight of local tradition, the unwritten code of what had always been done in a particular village for generations. A lord might own the land, but if he tried to impose a new tax that violated the ancient customs of the manor, his own tenants could and would take him to court to defend their traditional rights. This was a world where the past held a legal veto over the present. Enforcement was a deeply personal affair, far removed from our impersonal justice systems. Justice was meted out in the manorial court, held in the great hall, or even outdoors under a spreading oak tree. Here, the jury was not a panel of strangers, but a group of your own neighbors, the very people who knew your character, your disputes, and your reputation. They judged cases based on their intimate knowledge of local affairs, applying the law through the lens of communal memory. The church operated its own parallel system of courts, handling matters from moral offenses like adultery to the fulfillment of spiritual contracts like tithe payments. Punishment was rarely a private matter behind prison walls. It was a public spectacle, a moral drama staged for the entire community. A man locked in the stocks for selling bad ale was not just being punished, he was being reintegrated through ritual humiliation. The rotten fruit thrown at him was a physical manifestation of the community's disapproval, a necessary step to restore the harmony he had broken by his cheating. The law's purpose was not just to penalize an individual, but to teach a public lesson and reaffirm the shared values that held society together. This intimate, localized, and deeply religious understanding of law explains why these 22 statutes, so bizarre to our modern eyes, made perfect sense in their own world. They were not arbitrary acts of tyranny, but logical applications of a world where God, community, and custom were the ultimate legislators. The echoes of this world still resonate in our own legal foundations, shaping concepts we now take for granted. From the weight of your bread to the cry for justice, these 22 laws reveal a world where authority was a constant, intimate presence. They paint a portrait of a society fundamentally obsessed with hierarchy, community, and a divinely ordained moral order, enforcing its ideals with a startling and often brutal specificity. Every statute, from the Sumptuary laws to the Lord's Monopolies, was designed to cement a person's place in a rigid social structure, to protect the collective from the dangers of fire, fraud, and famine, and to uphold a cosmic blueprint where everyone knew their role. This was a legal landscape not of individual rights, but of communal duties and divinely sanctioned control. While many of these rules seem alien and oppressive to our modern sensibilities, their legacy is subtly woven into the very fabric of our own lives. The Assize of Bread and Ale, with its terrifying punishments for cheaters, is a direct ancestor of our consumer protection agencies and food safety standards. The medieval building codes that mandated stone walls and tile roofs evolved into our complex urban planning and fire safety regulations. The principle behind the hue and cry, the legal duty to assist your neighbor, echoes in our own concepts of civic responsibility and public order. These ancient statutes remind us that law is never just a collection of abstract rules. It is a living, breathing reflection of a society's deepest fears, its most cherished values, and its fundamental priorities. We hope this journey into the legal landscape of the Middle Ages has been as enlightening for you as it was for us. If you found these historical insights fascinating, please like this video, subscribe for more deep dives into the past, and share your thoughts on the most surprising law in the comments below.